Good morning. Thank you for being here. I heard great things about this conference. Unfortunately, I missed it last year, and I'm thrilled to be here. And I'm going to be more of a warm-up act for the great line of speakers you have for the rest of the day. And I'm actually keen to listen to some of the insights that's lined up for you today. The topic for today is autonomous knowledge economy. But a big disclaimer is I'm neither an expert in automobile industry nor an expert in publishing. So just to set the expectation, there's not going to be great insights, but it's actually me wondering out loud in terms of macro observations across industry. So let me start with a very small story. Back home in New York, there were two car dealers near my home. And as I was driving past them year after year, I was observing some tangible changes in what the car dealer used to be and what they look like year after year. There were tangible changes. And it was fascinating to observe them and try to understand whatever changes that was happening to the car dealership was not in isolation. They were impacts of major macro changes happening in the auto industry. So you can't look at the auto industry in isolation without understanding what's happening in the transportation industry. The same way, when we want to look at publishing, the changes that are happening in our industry, it's important for us to appreciate some of the macro shifts that are happening all around us. Because our customers, just like you and I, don't live in the publishing world. They live in the real world, are being impacted and influenced by these number of changes that are happening across industry. So with that, we're going to look at a few topics here. One, just starting at a broad level, what are the big changes that's happening in economy? What are the changing rules of the economy where we play across industry? And then we'll take a quick peek at the auto industry, and this just in terms of observation on where they started, where they are, and how they're going to continue to evolve. And then we'll sort of dive into what does that mean for knowledge economy and what parallels could we pull from there. And then I'm going to try and hopefully translate it to what does it mean for us. But that's more of a question for us to ponder beyond this conversation. So if we start with the basic rules of economy, over several decades, the rules have been very basic. Any company, any industry, if they manage the balance between supply and demand, it's quite helpful. And the rules have been primarily optimizing these three areas: how you control production, how you manage your pricing, and how you place your product, whether in the analog world or the digital world. I'm simplifying it to make a point. Obviously, there's a lot more complexity behind this to run a business. But the point is, if you got these three things right, you're reasonably successful commercially. And that's worked for decades across many, many industries. But what's fascinating is the business mantra and the playbook that's been out there pretty much favored the supply side rather than the demand side. And what it's led to is, just to borrow an expert out there, the side effects of those economy, which has made us, a lot of us, really successful, has created very complex experience for our customers, created redundant intermediaries because we didn't focus enough around the experience. And then in few areas, there's broken trust between the producer and the consumer. In many industry level, in some cases, it's very specific to companies. And there are businesses that have grown by limiting access rather than enabling access. That may sound familiar to you in terms of the industry we are in. So what has happened is more profit the supplier makes, it makes the experience more complicated for the customer on the demand side. And there's a new emerging economy, and it's not very specific to any industry. You could broadly apply to most industries what's happening. And these are broad observations on what are these economic rules. Primary one, if you look at the current economic model where we control the supply, you control the production. In the new economy, the entry barrier for production has been shattered, which means there's abundance of supply. The supply has been unconstrained. And you could draw the parallel into any industry on what is happening. What that has led to is your business models are no longer driven by the supplier. It's actually driven by the consumers and the customers. They want to start to drive these models based on what their needs are and what their context are. And what that's leading to is our current definition of product and whatever they are. They could be a book, journal, a course, or a degree, whatever they are, they're being unbundled. They've been unbundled by many, many players coming in and offering a specific set of product offerings that addresses a very, very specific goal. And they're all tied together. At the end of it, it comes into a product satisfaction is no longer measured by the overall product quality. It's getting increasingly precise. It's getting increasingly granular in terms of how we measure product quality and how it addresses our basic need. So with that backdrop as changing economic rules, I'll come into some specific examples in this industry. But first, let's take a step back and look at auto industry, because that's quite familiar for all of us. So you could use any industry for that matter, but let's look at auto in terms of where they started, what they've been through, and what they're about to go through. Now, cars have been there way before this point of time. If this is Ford Model T, which happened around roughly 1912, 1916. There's been a number of cars manufactured prior to that, but for argument's sake, let's use this as a placeholder for the official kickoff of the revolution and the beginning of the industry, right? What happened there was they were disrupting a personal transportation model that existed before. In fact, the early days, the marketing was about these are horseless carts. That's how they were marketed in the early days. So they were disrupting a personal transportation that existed with motor engine, and the industry has evolved over the past 100 years, roughly. And there's been quite a bit of evolution that has happened. Forgetting the details for a second, all it is saying is throughout this 100 years, many players, the largest ones, continuing to innovate the format, the nature of the product, how it's used, many internal and external players partnering together as an industry. What you saw in 1912 to where we are, there's been a significant transformation. And supported by both internal innovation as well as external innovation, which is quite normal for any industry that's continuing to make money. There's enough demand, and they are building things based on their supply proposition. And then an external disruption happens. Not necessarily a successful one, but an external disruption happens from an external party. Now, the concept behind it it's not a new one. It's always been there. But it allows an external party to come and redefine the model on how we see transport, how we see cars. But what that's led to is a complete reimagination. Although the guy who disrupted didn't really make a successful model out of it, but it just opened up the space for new entrants to come in and completely redefine the product category. Now, Tesla still looks like a car that we're familiar with. They didn't change, the total definition of what car looks like. But if you go back to GM or Ford and any of the successful car manufacturers and ask them a question about how much do they know about their drivers, how much do they know about their passengers in terms of what they like, what they don't like, and how much that is built into their product management. You'll hear plenty of evidence in terms of surveys and customer feedback and all of that, but no one has paid attention to the way Tesla and some of the newer models are doing. They stopped taking in oil, but they start taking in data. The car is filled with sensors where they're gathering data at a very granular level, which is going to help you, make the product experience so much more better than what it has been. Going back to our complex experience, when you don't focus on your demand, when you don't focus on your customers and consumers, you won't be able to tailor the experience. And that's exactly what Tesla is doing. And some of the speakers today, Kunal, Rebecca, are going to touch on how you bring in data and customer input into your product definition. And it's just the beginning in terms of how this would model this whole product category. Now, of course, once this is out, the larger industry will start to adopt it and see how can we use data for benefit. The data they've been gathering actually allows them, for a car which started as a semi-automatic 100 years ago, to a car that can co-pilot or potentially be in autopilot mode, right? Now, I'm not advocating for the type of data they gather and how they collect, right? But the value of it, that's not the discussion here. The value of the data that's being used to improve the experience of the customer, of the passengers, and the safety and all of that. And technology has played a significant role in terms of the auto industry evolution. Technology was originally used to assist the experience. Over the past decade, it's actually trying to automate things more efficiently. And ultimately, over the next decade, we can look forward to turning that into a completely autonomous business and autonomous product. Going back to our rules, over the past few decades, because of entry barriers that has been knocked out, there's an unconstrained supply in terms of cars, in terms of options. People don't have to own the whole thing. There are a lot of specialists that offers products in, so that's changing because there's so much supply out there. The car ownership, where the mainstream industry played, is actually shifting, which is allowing customers to define what their needs are. Some of them just want to share a ride. Some of them want to rent it. Some of them want to do peer-to-peer rental. And there's not even an exhaustive list. But not just the product is changing, but how people want to use their product is significantly changing. So this is when the demand is actually driving these business models, not necessarily the supplier. And what this has led to, which I talked about, your product gets unbundled very, very quickly. This would resonate with you in terms of publishing, in terms of what is happening today. But there are highly innovative, disruptive startups or incumbents that are coming in and offering great services that can be embedded and integrated into these cars. What's fascinating is when you look at why does Google and Apple want to get into car industry or into this automobile. There's a lot of speculation about it. They want to make sure they embed their technology into it. If somebody want to make their own car model out of it, there's a lot of speculation. But what's profound to me is those guys look at the value unit very differently than the mainstream car manufacturers. And let that sink in a bit, and let's look at how that would apply for knowledge economy. The value unit for the car manufacturing is a car, number of cars sold. But the value unit, these guys are looking at it, is number of miles driven. And when you look at number of miles driven and how can you monetize that, now you're looking at 1 trillion miles a year, not a few million cars sold a year. It completely changes the equation. It redefines the market landscape as we know it. Now, of course, the performance measurement of car is not new. Where it's been really successful is in Formula One, right? Every Formula One cars out there has hundreds of sensors picking up performance of individual components and actually continue to indicate and actually in some cases predict if the driver is going to win or not. And data has played a significant role in terms of Formula One. It's not necessarily the drivers that win the race. Increasingly, it's the data that they gather, which is helping them precisely optimize the performance, which I think there's plenty for us to learn if you take that into knowledge economy. Now, knowledge economy is a very abstract, ambiguous term, so you can define it the way you like it. But if we say it is about information business, we can cut it different ways. And if we say, for argument's sake, the genesis of this is when the printing press were invented, although information has been delivered prior to that since 200th century. The printing has evolved quite a bit over the past 600 years. Shouldn't be news to many of you or to all of us in terms of how the format of printing has evolved significantly through technology. But if you notice something, this is very much about the supply side. So when the Gutenberg printing machine was invented in 1453 to here we are, you got print on demand, completely changing the way we produce content, we distribute content. Most of these evolution and innovation has been about process and formats on how we deliver things, right? Which is fantastic, which is great because we're making leaps and bounds in terms of how content used to be produced to how it is being produced now. But I'm positive content is consumed very differently in 2017 than how it was consumed in 1453, right? Why is that a problem? The problem is the amount of content that's being produced, right? About 100 years ago, every century the content doubled, right? The knowledge and information doubled. And 50 years later was every 25 years. And the time we are living in, almost every year, the amount of knowledge, human knowledge, is doubling up. And by 2020, which is right around the corner, it's going to double up twice a day, right? So good luck if we are in the business of harnessing the large amount of content, right? So that's the whole point of how the supply side of equation is going to be completely challenged, is being completely challenged. And can we really build a bigger vessel to contain the data? So disruption is happening, and it's almost an amorphous word right now when you talk about disruption in knowledge economy. But it's mainly bolstered by three big areas. You have the big digital giants, Facebook, Amazon, Google, and Microsoft, who are making big bets in the space on how they want to position their platform to play a major role in this area. And then, many of you starting to make smarter investments in specific areas in terms of how would we harness the power of this. And then, of course, there's always these tiny little startups which come out of nowhere and try to address very, very specific gaps. But the good news is, while all this disruption is shaking the industry, trying to make sense out of how we're going to handle the large amount of content that's being produced and how do you match it to a very, very specific user's need is really the question. I don't have a punchline there. I don't have an answer. That's the question we're all grappling with. Which has led to, whether you look at news or learning or publishing, as unconstrained and abundance of supply. What used to be a nicely packaged degree course is being fragmented, is actually getting more precise in terms of moving away from course to skills to role, and how can you help prepare people towards to do what they do better. I won't get into too much detail, but the amount of data that's been created every day, what really impressed me was we create about 1 exabyte worth of data every day on the internet. So when they talk about data has grown exponentially, they're not kidding. It is growing exponentially. Because of the supply, whether you're a researcher or a librarian or a student or a postdoc, whoever you are, your needs are becoming very, very specific, which is actually influencing how they want to pay for content, how they want to consume content. It's very much around usage-driven rather than what we produce. It's really important, which I'm sure some of the colleagues will touch on this, is it's really useful to understand the context and goal of our customer to figure out the right value proposition that makes sense for them. Moving on, what that has led to is an accelerated unbundling of our services For example, when we look at learning, and this is slightly outdated, but when you look at learning, what used to be as a degree course in a college is being unbundled with these incredible number of valuable services. So this begs the question of, if you're a learning provider, what is your role? What is your future role? Are you going to tie them together to offer a unified experience? Or are you going to play in one of those boxes, adding very precise value? That's really the challenge. In terms of performance measurement, it's no longer a binary, whether you came in or out. It's much more about, are we adding the right amount of value in a very granular way? And a lot of these platforms are building that capability, not only to share with their customers, but also for their own measurement. Are we measuring the impact rather than the input that we offer? Right. The good news is the reimagination hasn't happened yet, right? That's the good news. While there are a lot of disruptive forces that are playing in, there are plenty of innovation that's coming in, the reimagination of how the production of content need to align with consumption hasn't completely happened yet. And I think that's in this room and many other areas where people are actively working on it. Chris is going to talk about, what's the role AI would play in this right after this. So I would like all of us to, sort of continue to think about what is our role in it and what does the reimagination look like. This would look completely familiar to you. Publishing is already unbundled, right? There are many great ideas that are coming from inside and outside. They're taking slices of it. How discovery of content used to work in the internet world is being redefined by many players out here. And how people would want to consume it and actually measure the impact is being changed. So I'm sure we are all playing somewhere here, where it begs the question in terms of in 3 years, if knowledge is going to double up, or content producer is going to be double up every 12 hours, we better be ready for that scale that we're dealing with. So just to summarize, when you look at sort of the value proposition in terms of what is happening, the shifts are moving away from supply to demand, purchase to usage, which many of us are already seeing, owning to sharing, which is increasingly becoming mainstream. And it's no longer any one player owning the value chain. It is a networked ecosystem for us to support each other and ultimately support our customers. Not that dollar would ever go out of fashion, but data is gaining more traction than dollar, which is quite evident in what is happening there. And then it's no longer helpful to focus on the input, but it is very much helpful to focus on the impact that we offer to the customer, whatever their needs are. So with that, I would like to conclude. With that backdrop, what does it mean for each and every one of us? There are a large amount of publishers here and service providers and partners. We can choose to use the set of technologies and capabilities that are in the room, outside the room, whether it's AI or big data, to simply assist our existing business, or we can focus on automating what we do well efficiently. Or with this explosion of content, you could perhaps help reframe it to be truly an autonomous economy, to be an autonomous model. I don't know what that looks like, but I'll leave with that question. And thank you for your attention. Thank you very much.